VIDEl sighed in frustration and took out her GPS and map again. The sound of waves lapping at the shore reached her ears, but despite the calm sounds the girl wasn't relaxed at all. She looked searchingly out across the ocean, the water in the distance reflecting in her bright eyes. She'd been so sure this time that she was on the right track, and that the information she discovered recently would lead her to Master Roshi's island. "VIDEl, I'm tired," whined Arasa from a few feet away. The girl looked over to her friend who'd dropped to her backside on the ground in protest at how long they'd been searching. Arasa for once had dressed quite sensibly for this outing, in a casual t-shirt and shorts, and the lightweight jacket she was now stuffing into her backpack. "And I've got too much sand in my sandals," she pouted. "Then go wash them in the ocean," VIDEl responded bluntly while looking at her watch. It was approaching midday and the sun was bright overhead, with a cloudless blue sky. Despite this, it wasn't uncomfortably warm, still in the cool weeks of late spring. The blonde slowly got to her feet. "Fine," she responded as she pulled a towel out of her backpack and shuffled to the edge of the water to rinse her feet and shoes free of the sand. VIDEl watched her friend with a fond smile, despite the somewhat harsh tone of her last comment. Somehow Arasa had been convinced by VIDEl to come with her for a few days since they hadn't had much time to spend together lately, with VIDEl spending most of her time training at home lately, and almost as much on this latest side project she'd been working on. Arasa wasn't particularly interested in the people VIDEl had spent the last few years trying to track down, but had been swayed by promises of the beautiful beaches and islands they'd get to explore this time. Today so far hadn't quite been the fun beach day VIDEl knew Arasa might have been expecting though, VIDEl's persistence not allowing them much time for breaks. The latest impediment had set her plans to give them both time to rest even further back. Did she get the coordinates wrong? No, it had definitely been the right place, they'd triple-checked as they were hovering above in her jetcopter. However, from above the island looked totally deserted, with barely any signs of life at all, let alone evidence of someone living there. He was known as the Turtle Hermit, and she had previously considered that he might live in a cave or somewhere equally remote or without modern conveniences, but the island was so small that it hadn't been possible for anyone to be hidden there. Once they landed on the tiny island, while there were a few footprints here and there, it had otherwise been entirely devoid of signs of habitation. After they'd realized the island was empty though, they'd returned to the closest beach on the mainland for a break and for VIDEl to consider their next move. She looked down at the map again while trying to clear her thoughts. 5 years ago as an 11-year-old she'd won the junior division of the World Martial Arts Tournament, the same year her father had won the adult title. It had been an incredible achievement, even if she did say so herself, considering she was fighting against other kids, mostly boys, who were both older than her and physically so much stronger. Although she was unusually strong for someone of her size and stature, she'd needed to develop her fighting style based on her speed and reactions, and she recalled the elation she'd felt that day and the dreams she'd had of the skill level and abilities she might be able to achieve as she grew older. However, her progress had stalled a few years after that, with her father no longer training her directly. He'd spouted something about having to secretly train alone on some new and dangerous techniques, and wouldn't rethink his position despite her continual protests in the months immediately afterward. In all honesty, she'd also begun to lose faith that what she and her father were capable of was anything in comparison to what the fighters of previous recent tournaments had been. She'd pored over articles and tapes of previous fights and knew most of them punch by punch, and could name every qualifier and competitor for tournaments going back decades. The feats of some of those fighters was beyond the comparatively rudimentary punching, kicking, and grappling that was now standard in the current world of martial arts. There had been energy beams shooting out of people's hands, fighters defying gravity and flying through the air, entire rings being destroyed, and various other techniques her father could only describe as tricks. VIDEl wasn't entirely convinced these weren't real, and irrespective of whether they were or not, she'd needed to somehow find at least one of these fighters and speak with them. In a perfect world one might even be willing to take her on as a long-term student, but she wasn't holding out much hope for that. So she'd been trying to track down previous World Martial Arts Tournament participants off and on since in what limited spare time she had, with mixed results. Right now she was after one of the top targets on her list, Master Roshi. Deciding to take off her boots and socks, she put them into one of her storage capsules which she subsequently packed away in her backpack. Now barefoot, she could feel the sand of the beach beneath her feet and between her toes. Going barefoot on grass or sand always helped calm her down and feel more connected to the earth, as it did for most people she imagined. Closing her eyes, she thought back to the breathing and mindfulness techniques Nam had taught her, one of the fighters she had been able to track down, and a former semi-finalist at that. A good-hearted man, he had understood how genuine she was and had allowed her to stay with his family for a few days. The meditation techniques he'd taught her had definitely raised her level as well as giving her ways to refocus her mind when she was under pressure or stressed. This moment she wouldn't give up, but she needed to calm her frustration at the current situation. The coordinates may not have led her directly to Master Roshi's island yet, but she was confident that there was an element of truth to the information and that he had at least at some point been on that island or somewhere close. There are lots of islands out here, she spoke out loud to herself, realizing of course that it wouldn't be difficult for the hermit to relocate easily between them. While she was in this area she had to at least scour the other islands close by. She picked her map and GPS back up which she'd set on the ground when removing her shoes and socks, and started to unfold the map in her hand further so that she could see a wider area, but a shout from her friend had her distracted from the task quickly. VIDEl, can you come here please? Arasa yelled worriedly from the edge of the water about 50 feet away. VIDEl set off immediately, her bare feet pounding against the sand as she jogged across the beach quickly, concerned about the genuine nervousness she'd heard in her friend's voice. Are you hurt, Arasa? Arasa didn't look at VIDEl, instead pointed along the beach to their right as they faced the water. What's that? The blonde asked. From this position closer to the ocean they could see further around the curve of the beach, where their view had previously been blocked by the jungle behind them. VIDEl's eyes followed the direction of Arasa's pointing to where a light plume of smoke rose from a spot on the beach into the sky. It was difficult to see at this distance, but at the base of the smoke inside a crater, wide but shallow in depth, there was what looked to be a small spherical boulder, which seemed to be the origin of the smoke. This is what Arasa was so worried about. I'm sure it's nothing, she responded as calmly as possible, hoping to reassure her friend. Maybe someone just had a bonfire and it's still smoldering. Her explanation was logical, but as her blue eyes lingered on it longer she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unusual about the boulder. As much as she couldn't explain it, something was emanating from it, a strange, ominous feel. Maybe it was her imagination getting the better of her, but something was causing a knot in her stomach. She swallowed thickly and refocused as she realized she was being ridiculous. Like she'd said to Arasa, it was most likely just the remains of a bonfire earlier in the day or yesterday, and that boulder had probably been a good shield from any wind or otherwise just a good spot to sit. It had probably been there for years doing no harm to anyone. Let's walk down the beach to it, I'm sure it's nothing. If you're sure, Arasa responded. They both set off, walking barefoot on the sand where it was easiest to walk between the water's edge and the drier part of the beach, gradually getting closer to the smoke. As they grew nearer, the features of the boulder started to become clearer. It was almost perfectly spherical, and was a very pale gray or dirty white color apart from a round muddy red blotch in the center which was slightly reflective, the sun's rays bouncing off it. It doesn't look like a rock to me. You're right, Arasa, it looks mechanical, VIDEl said as they approached further and could now make out that without a doubt whatever it was not a boulder, and was man-made in nature. It looks like a satellite or a space probe. But how did it land here and survive the fall with such minor damage if it just crashed? She asked as she looked up into the sky. And don't they normally just burn up in re-entry anyway? I dunno, but who knows what technology they have nowadays. We are close to the water, maybe it was planned and it was supposed to land in the water and they'd recover it. Arasa suggested hopefully. VIDEl looked around following Arasa's point, which wasn't a bad one. She thought if that was the case there might at least be some kind of parachutes or airbags to slow the fall or soften the landing. What if it's a spaceship? Arasa asked, excited all of a sudden. Don't be ridiculous, Arasa, you know our technology is nowhere near space travel. We can barely send satellites up there. There's no technology like that we know of, but who knows what kind of research the government is up to, or companies like Capsule Corp. They might be sending freaky space pods out there all the time for all we know. As they spoke, the two of them were now upon the pod, as Arasa had called it, and while Arasa hovered near what they now thought of as the front, VIDEl did a loop around it and returned to Arasa. The back was the same pale color with few markings, and underneath it in some areas the sand had turned to shards of glass, whether through heat or pressure or a combination of both. Maybe you should hang back a bit, VIDEl cautioned her friend as she thought back to the strange feeling she got when they were first discussing the smoke. The knot in her stomach hadn't gone away, and if there was something fishy going on she couldn't allow Arasa to get hurt. No way. Okay, but just get ready to get behind me or run if I tell you, VIDEl ordered as they moved closer again to the red circle which they now realized was some kind of glass. I think there's someone inside, Arasa exclaimed. VIDEl couldn't believe it, but Arasa was right. The round window was somewhat transparent, although foggy and difficult to see through even up close, and was dark inside apart from the tiniest glow of a small red blinking light inside. But an outline of a person, what looked to be a man, was inside. VIDEl pressed her face to the glass, holding her hands around her eyes to block out as much peripheral light as possible. Some kind of mask covered the bottom half of his face, tubes extending out from it to each side. VIDEl backed off from the window a little, remembering that she'd never seen any technology like this. Her curiosity was battling against her discomfort, which was growing even higher than it already had been. Arasa, you really should get behind me, she said as the latter won out for once. Maybe you're right. Arasa went to move. A hiss originated from the sphere, making them both jump. Suddenly cracks were visible around the section containing the central red window, and it started to lever open as the sound of pistons inside could be heard. VIDEl moved back quickly, shepherding Arasa behind her. A second later what they now realized was a door to whatever this was had completely opened, and now entirely visible inside was a young man. Even in broad daylight though it was difficult to make out his clothing and features, as from his chest up he was almost entirely covered in some kind of dark grime or dust, and that mask was still covering his mouth and nose. VIDEl and Arasa didn't dare move for about 10 seconds, not knowing if he was about to immediately spring to life or if this pod was going to have another surprise for them. When neither the pod nor the man inside moved they both crept back closer, having regained at least a little confidence. "What's he covered in? Is it mud, or camouflage paint or oil or something?" asked Arasa once they got as close as they could. VIDEl looked him up and down and tentatively smelled the air as close as she dared to get. A sick feeling overtook her. There was definitely mud in whatever gunk he seemed to have had dumped on him given how copiously it covered him. But there was something else she'd realized was all over him based on the smell in the air, that she could unfortunately now almost taste. "I think it's blood." She could hear Arasa swallow with nervousness next to her, and saw her turn away slightly. "If he's lost that much blood he can't still be alive." VIDEl studied his body closely. "I don't think it's his blood," she said quietly after a few moments. "At least not all of it. You're not making me feel more comfortable with this situation, VIDEl," Arasa croaked. "I'm sorry. What do we do? No matter who he is we have to help him if he's hurt, if he's even alive that is," her drive to help others kicking in. She watched his chest but couldn't even tell if he was breathing. If he was his breaths were too shallow to be visible or audible. She'd have to get even closer to check for his breathing and for a pulse. The door to the pod was awkwardly placed and she had to lean over with one shoulder braced against the body of it to get far enough into it to reach him. Avoiding some kind of bulky outerwear the man was wearing she dared to place her hand on his chest where the fabric of his clothing was thinner. The solidity of him surprised her, not that she had any experience of touching the chest of guys apart from when she was punching or kicking them. Even holding her hand in place for what felt like the longest few seconds of her life, unfortunately there were still no signs of life. She wanted to place her hand near his mouth or nose to see if she could feel his breath but considering it might be the only thing keeping him alive she didn't dare touch the mask. It had 2 tubes running from it to each side, linking to other apparatus of the pod, and definitely looked like some kind of ventilator. Instead she lightly tapped his forehead with her finger, then his left cheek above the mask and just beneath his left eye but there was no reaction. "Why are you poking him?" Arasa whispered. VIDEl ignored her friend and carried on. "Can you hear me?" she asked, but as she'd expected there was no response. She put her hand back on his chest to try to check his breathing again. Feeling nothing she looked at Arasa who looked back with unease. Getting increasingly concerned that this man was sadly already dead, she went next to check his pulse. If there was still nothing she wouldn't give up though. She'd figure out a way to remove that mask, lift him out of here and try whatever emergency measures she could take. She'd have Arasa call the emergency services in a second while she continued to do what she could. She knew in the back of her mind though they were tens of miles from the closest settlement, and the chances of an ambulance, or Coast Guard, or whoever the hell could get out here reaching them in good time, if at all, was almost certainly nil. She stared at his face again for a moment. With the blood and grime on his face it really did look like he was wearing camouflage face paint like Arasa had said. The mud and blood was so thick that it was a reddish brown that was almost black, and it was caked over his face and ears, even his hair. It was horrifying. What in God's name had he been doing to get into this state, and where did he come from? "Whoever you are, despite whatever mess you're involved in I hope you're still alive," she muttered. "Please don't be dead," she added. Finally VIDEl reached her hand out to his wrist in order to check his pulse, keeping a close eye on his face. Her fingers were inches from his wrist when something furry, warm, yet alarmingly strong wrapped around her forearm. In shock and fear she froze, and her blood ran cold. Her eyes hadn't left his face which still hadn't moved or twitched at all. Arasa gasped loudly behind her, having now seen whatever it was encircling her best friend's left forearm. Slowly VIDEl moved her eyes to her arm and saw what looked like a thick brown rope holding her arm in place. No, not a rope. It looked more like a tail. Unable to move, whether due to fear of this appendage which had come from who knows where keeping her in place, all she could do was raise her eyes back to his face. Now looking back at her were 2 narrowed eyes containing a depth of aggression and brutality that she couldn't fathom. The irises were as black as the pupils, or so dark brown she couldn't even tell the difference, and the whites of his eyes looked impossibly stark against this and the grime covering his face, and the dark gray of the breathing mask. With his eyes looming against the darkness of his face and mask around them he was like something escaped from hell, and somehow she was both frozen in fear and shaking with it at the same time. VIDEl wasn't even sure if she was breathing but her heart was absolutely hammering in her chest. She held his gaze for a few more seconds, unable to look away, but eventually it was as though a switch flicked somewhere in him. Something softened in his eyes slightly, as did the iron grip around her arm. After this for a second she also saw as much shock in his eyes as she knew must be visible in her own, but they didn't break eye contact. "Not dead yet." The voice was hoarse, its sound robotic through the mask. The sound broke VIDEl's thoughts, and she jumped with surprise. She hadn't been expecting him to talk, nor had Arasa, who screamed behind her at the astonishment of hearing him speak. Prompted by the sound of Arasa's scream, the man glanced at her friend, and VIDEl knew she had to take more control here. She was one of the best martial artists in the world, for God's sake. With all of her strength she wrenched herself away from whatever was wrapped around her forearm, feeling it loosely trail her against her wrist and hand, with the thought in the back of her mind that she may have had little to do with it and had simply been released from its grip. Setting it aside as irrelevant, she moved to stand stood in front of Arasa protectively, getting into a defensive stance. "Hey, you two, get away from him," a man's voice called clearly from behind them. VIDEl was hesitant to take her focus from the man in the pod, but the instinct to turn to that shout was natural, and behind them, landing on the beach out of nowhere and effortlessly falling into a sprint, was unmistakably Krillin, former World Martial Arts Tournament semifinalist. Despite his hair having grown out, his features were unmistakable to VIDEl, who had the faces of all of the former competitors memorized. At Krillin's insistence, VIDEl backed up, corralling Arasa behind her. Krillin ran to a position beside them and dropped into a defensive stance. The trio watched as the mysterious man slowly removed the mask from his face, and levered himself out of the pod with his bloody hands.